Up an unsanitary tributary without adequate means of propulsion.
That's a good way to put
it. You're listening to the Help Me with HIPAA podcast, where HIPAA and humor collide to make learning fun. Your delightful hosts are Donna Grindle and David Sims. Relax. HIPAA help is on the way.
Hi, I'm Dee Dee Dunlap from Perkins County Health Services in Grant, Nebraska, and you're listening to the Help Me with HIPAA podcast.
Thank you for that intro and welcome to Help Me with HIPAA podcast. My name is David Sims of HIPAA for MSPs and Security First IT. Joining me is my co-host, Donna Grindle of Garden.
Thank you, my co-host, David Sims.
Yes. So for those of you who were at the boot camp this past week, you know what we're talking about.
No, right.
So the boot camp was this week. Had a blast, man. I always love hanging out with these people. They're great.
I know. And then I slept for a long time, but shout out to Denise. That's right. You knew the shout out was coming because
yeah. Denise let me down. She let me down. So
hey, you're going to be reading Denise's comments about the podcast everywhere. She promised.
Yeah. So for the listeners, what we do at the boot camp is we ask people if they want to participate in recording the opener for the boot camp, or for the podcast, when we, take them off to the side and let them record and all that. And Denise would not do it. She flat out was like, I can't.
So in exchange for that, David has done it for her. There you go. Yeah. Here's David's Denise recording.
Hi, I'm Denise, and you're listening to the Help Me with HIPAA podcast. So, but I figured she didn't want to be, outed from her witness protection program or whatever it is she's in. I don't know, but anyway, we got everybody else to do it. So I had a blast, and the OCR lady that came in on day 3, I mean, it solidified everything we did from day 1 and 2, and there were still people's jaws hitting the tables as she was talking.
I know, eyes popping out of their heads. That's right.
Yep.
Jeremy's eyes were popping right on out of his head at one point. But we didn't get to talk about that. We don't promote that or share it, but we were able to work that out this time. Now that we have 3 days, we're getting to be a little bit more creative. And we brought in one of the investigators out of the Atlanta office to tell us how investigations work. And we just did like a really hangout Q&A with Allison, who we greatly appreciate her stopping by. And everybody was, at first it's like, I don't know that I want to say anything.
Yeah, I'll ask a question, but, I'm not telling you the name of my practice.
But, I mean, she was really, really informative. And, we're trying to tell her there's some things happening that you just don't understand out there. But overall, it was like here you go. She reiterated everything that we said. Mm-hmm. For all the work that we did, she reiterated it. So it was perfect.
Yeah. So then, we're actually able to say Donna didn't just make this crap up. I've always wondered.
Well, it gets back to what's reasonable and appropriate. What can you make the argument that it's reasonable and appropriate? Well, there were some very important things that she pointed out. And, the folks that were there really, got a lot out of it. They loved it. So we're going to try to do that again whenever we have our next one. I think we're going to do a poll and see who we can get to commit for another one. But we've got to figure out when that'll be in the fall, whenever that is.
Absolutely. But that was a great time. I always enjoy them. They're fun and exhausting all at the same time.
Yes. Yes. But even the folks that are at Smoke Rise Country Club, they're now used to it. I think we're going to have to start giving them CEU credits. But for those of you who are interested in the boot camp, send us an email. And, we can give you referrals on how awesome the boot camp is. And hopefully we'll see you at one soon.
Absolutely.
All right.
So, other than the boot camp, you have anything else coming up?
By the time this comes out, I've got something in September that I booked for going to Memphis in September to speak at the Tennessee Ambulatory Surgical Center Conference. Yeah, I know, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm doing that September 26th, I want to say. It's the last Thursday in September. And I'm looking forward to that, going up to Memphis and meeting with those folks, because I did Georgia, South Carolina last year. Now I'm going to do Tennessee, and I think maybe back to Georgia soon. And I've got a couple of the folks that we met at SOMSA that we're talking to them about doing things in September. So I've already booked 3 dates in September. Just can't talk about them all yet.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them, because they're private, they get to invite people. I don't get to invite people. So I try not to talk about them on the podcast. So, there's a cool thing that some of these folks do, that they rely on referrals. So what they do is once a year, they host something that is like a half-day seminar kind of thing. And they invite all the different folks, and you learn about them, and you have a featured speaker. And I am the featured speaker, not the previous featured speaker. And so I've done a couple of these, and they're really cool. And so I've already booked another one of those. And I got, Lunch and Learn is on June 13th. If you want information about that, shoot us an email, contact@helpmewithhippa.com. I'll be talking about medical records release. And you get a free lunch with that one.
Cool. Ain't no such thing as a free lunch, but anyway.
Yeah, you got to listen to me.
Yeah. You might want to eat before she starts talking. I don't know, maybe afterwards. So you don't lose your lunch.
Moving right along.
Depends on the topic. Should be okay with this one, though. But anyway, so today's topic, we're actually going to be talking about sanctions. How do you sanction?
How you doing it?
Yeah. What's in your wallet? But before we do that, let me remind everybody that today's podcast episode is brought to you in part by Carden. Yes, Donna Grendel's company, Carden. Did you know that 83% of healthcare organizations report a strong negative impact to their bottom line after a data breach? So many doctors think that they're HIPAA compliant and have nothing to worry about. Many of those same organizations thought the same thing before it happened to them. But call Carden today at 678-292-5001 so they can assess your practice and help ensure you are protected and prepared. And visit cardenhq.com to learn more. That is cardenhq.com to learn more.
Wow, you didn't even butcher that one.
Over to you, Donna.
We're getting better at these. We're working them out a little at a time. But we're fortunate that our listeners have grown with us. If you go back and listen to episodes 1, 2, 3, the banter's basically the same, but the quality is very different.
The quality of banter is different.
Thanks to Bo. All right, so let's get into the sanction policies. As David said before we started, sanction policies for your kids. He thinks he can have one for his wife, which I thought was hysterical.
Yeah. It's not going to happen.
No. But, sanction policies are something that they're a part of life. Essentially law is a sanction policy.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't follow this law, this is what's going to happen. And everybody, I don't know. Some people decide not to sanction their children. But those of us who don't have kids appreciate those who sanction them by walking out of the restaurant with them. But, it's choices and consequences.
Mm-hmm.
I hear that all the time from my family members who are in the education world with the circles of small children. And it's all about choices and consequences. So why not have that in your business?
Well, you need it. Actually, you have to have it.
Well, yeah, you are. So we're going to talk today about sanctions. What are sanctions? Why you need them. How do you make them work? What kind of things do you need in your sanction policy so that you can evaluate how that is working for your organization overall? How about that?
So you mean to tell me that I actually have to follow a sanction policy, or I just have to have a sanction policy?
Yeah, that's one of the things we got into a good bit at the boot camp. You can have a policy and not follow it. That's still, pretty much willful neglect. We got the policy template. We filled them out. They're in a book somewhere. No one knows what they say.
Right.
Or even better, we've got X's over them and that says, okay, we're choosing not to follow this one anymore per so-and-so. Even better, even more wrong. But the law does say it. And what are sanctions? Okay, first of all, I get to get nerdy with it. It's a contronym or an autonym.
Okay.
Antonym, auto-antonym. You know what that means?
That means that it means two very different things.
One word, two meanings. There and there have two different spellings, so it's not the same.
I'm pretty much dealing with my wife every day.
So when you say, I'm sanctioning you, she thinks you mean like this treatment has been sanctioned by the FDA. What you really mean is the sanctions applied include removal of your license to drive.
Right.
There you go. So two different things. Sanctioning something could be approval. Sanctioning something could be disapproval. And it's all about context when we hear sanctions. And I think a lot of people forget that sometimes and don't put it into clear context. Yes, we have a sanction policy. We sanction people all the time. Does anybody know what we do? Basically, a sanction policy that exists that isn't followed is not the meaning of sanction that it's intended.
Right.
I always say, lack of disapproval implies approval.
That can happen. There also tends to be different sanction policies for different workers.
There again lies the problem. But HIPAA says there's basically, a lot of people don't realize there's 3 different types of sanctions in the HIPAA law.
Okay.
So you got the security rule sanction. It is a required element of the security rule that you apply appropriate sanctions against workforce members who fail to comply with the security policies and procedures of the covered entity or business associate. So if you fail to comply with the policies and procedures, you should be sanctioned. Not just if you have a data breach, you should be sanctioned. If you're failing to comply with the policies and procedures, and note that it says required.
So would that be something like you're not showing up for security awareness training?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I choose not to participate in training. That is a violation of our policy. Our policy says everyone must be trained. I choose not to sign off my workstation, and I ask IT to turn off some of the security things on my desktop because I choose not to participate. That is failure to follow policy. So everyone's supposed to know it, and everyone's supposed to follow it. That's a key element. But then there's also,
Yeah, following it.
Then there's also a sanction policy in the privacy rule. A covered entity must have and apply appropriate sanctions against members of its workforce who fail to comply with the privacy policies and procedures. Or, now in the privacy rule, it's interesting, policies and procedures of the covered entity or the requirements of this subpart or subpart D of this part. So it's basically saying, if you're not going to do any of this stuff, all of the privacy rule stuff applies. So you can, there's a whole bunch more than just the privacy rule. So it's hitting you hard right there.
Mm-hmm.
And then the last piece is HIPAA as a whole. I don't think people realize that the enforcement rule is a sanction policy. A covered entity must have and apply appropriate sanctions against members of its workforce for privacy and security, but the enforcement rule is basically OCR saying, well, this is how we're going to sanction you if you don't follow the rules.
Right. So they're going to sanction you if you don't sanction yourself.
Well, yeah, that's basically it,
Yeah.
If you go ahead and put yourself in timeout, generally, things get a lot easier.
Mm-hmm.
for everybody. Even my little dog, when he knows he's done something wrong, he walks in, puts his head down because he's going to get picked up and put in timeout. He knows it.
We do know that, if OCR comes in and they're doing an investigation, if you have sanctioned somebody and it looks like you've figured out the problem, you figured out who did it or didn't do it, and you sanction that person or persons, then they're likely going to be somewhat more lenient on what they do to you because you are following the rules and trying to participate in all aspects, including sanctions.
Exactly. And that was one of the things that Allison confirmed with us. It's important to show you're following the rules. And clearly, sanctions is part of the rules. And I would argue that since it's clear what levels of sanctions the culpability things that we talked about when we were talking about the penalties and how they apply them and decide essentially the sanctions against your business, those kind of things should apply equally. Because, why not? Why not use the similar approach with people who fail to comply with your policies and procedures? So you got reasonable cause that basically exercising reasonable diligence, you would have known that it violated the provisions, but you didn't act with willful neglect. You didn't just blow it off. You should have known. Reasonable diligence means that with the business care and prudence expected from a person to satisfy the legal requirement, you would expect people have done that because they know it's a legal requirement. And then you got willful neglect where it's like, screw it, I'm going to do whatever I want to do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Reckless indifference, those kind of things. Well, why not have that same approach towards your staff? If they know they're supposed to follow the policy, but they don't even care to look or get educated, they're not doing what's called reasonable diligence. I got a problem with that. Mm-hmm. If, they're really trying to follow the law, but they didn't pay attention in training, or they've overstepped and they should have, retreat, bring in, you need reinforcements. This needs to go to the privacy officer, or this needs to go, proper channels.
Right. So what we're talking about here is instead of saying, if you do this, this will happen, you're going to say, if you do this, then we're going to measure your actions against these 3 levels. And then we'll determine whether or not, or the sanctions we put against you, which is exactly what OCR is going to do to you.
Yeah. Just take a similar approach. Look at those. There's nothing wrong with that.
But this, it's perfect because we do have people sometimes, at least when I talk to them, they'll say, we create a sanction policy and we say, okay, if you send an email to the wrong person, you can be sanctioned all the way up to termination. Well, you haven't given anybody any real guidelines to go by. And then you kind of set yourself up for failure because you're not measuring anything. You're just saying this one person we're going to slap on the wrist and the next person we're going to fire, which is going to put you in line for a lawsuit.
Yeah, exactly.
So at least this gives you a way to measure that and then apply the punishment to that level of measurement.
Right. So why do sanctions matter so much? Well, if there's no consequences, what are people going to do? You know? And even if there are consequences, but they're not bad consequences, I'm willing to risk it.
Yeah.
Because it's not going to be bad enough to really bother me.
This is where I think we see a lot of your C-suite people and the owners of the business or doctors or whatever, is there typically are no consequences. They're the business owners or they're the C-suite. So there's few or no consequences for things like this.
Right. And that's why, it's that whole thing. Are you above the law? If you have the attitude you're above the law, then your staff will have the attitude that the law doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
So that whole attitude, if you want your staff to follow the rules, then they have to follow all the rules. Because if you're slack on some of the rules, but strict on the other rules, they're not going to take you seriously anyway.
Right.
It's like kids. People don't treat it that way, but that's the mindset is the same.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In our business, we do that. We have a sanction policy, and it applies to everybody. And I'll be the first to tell you, then I'll take 3 days off without pay if I do something wrong.
But at the same time, you hold yourself to a higher standard.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. But
And if you make a mistake and it's an outright mistake, that would be what you would do. You're not going to do intentional violations of your policies and procedures like some people, some business owners do.
no. And that's, going back to what we just talked about, that's where I think having those levels come into play. Because sometimes you can have something that went wrong, and it's not that somebody willfully did something, they just made a mistake. And if that's the case, then you don't have to apply the maximum punishment according to the law.
Right. But if this is the third mistake they've made, it's different.
Yeah. And then you have to look at, okay, are we having a training issue, or, you just don't understand, or you don't care? Is it time to, let you move on to bigger and better things, or what?
Or you could, do like the Art of War, Sun Tzu.
Mm-hmm.
The how you teach leaders. The story is he told them that he could make even the concubines warriors. And he goes off for a period of time. He's teaching them. He's selecting the leaders, all this kind of stuff. Then he has the leaders go teach the other people. He brings them in to show the warlord at the time, this is how you make leaders. And he tells one of the leaders he's selected, have your group do this. And one of them fails. So he tells the leader again, you need to teach them again, and has them teach them again. If they fail again, he cut the head off the leader. He's cut the head off the leader. He says, if you're obviously not teaching in a way that people take seriously. So bye-bye. And sure enough, the next leader was like, you will do it this way.
Yeah, that's a bit of a sanction policy there.
Yeah, I'm not encouraging that in any means, but we get the concept, and there's a reason that so many entrepreneurs and business owners do read The Art of War, because it is about that's how you build leaders, is you make them ultimately responsible for what their team does. Well, unfortunately, some business owners don't hold themselves to that standard, and that is unfortunate. Yeah. But we're going to assume everybody's doing the right thing and doing it, the way that it's intended. Actually, I wish we could just assume everybody do the right thing. But all of us do things like, that speed limit sign is merely a suggestion.
Yeah. Yeah,
some people.
I mean, when it comes to things like this, I do think that people at least start out in a job wanting to do the right thing. And what happens is they start seeing other people slipping up, and then they come to the realization of, what's the least amount I can do and still keep my job.
Well, that, or I do the right thing and, put in the extra hours. I do the extra work. I take the time to do it the right way. And everybody that's doing the shortcut way, not only do they have more time to themselves, get to goof off, but nothing happens to them.
Yeah. Yep. It takes a lot of personal integrity to keep that going.
Yeah. And you're asking that from every level of your company. Mm-hmm. But I mean, I've seen amazing things in conversations and court, depositions and all this kind of stuff. People say, well, as long as you keep your mouth shut, you can do anything you want. Just lay low and always say that you do understand the policies. Sign off on them. Or the only way you can get caught is one of those audits they do, and they don't look at anything other than logins, so don't worry about it. Heard that one. Even if you do get caught violating policy, all you have to do is watch the videos again and do that little test. It's no big deal. Don't worry about it.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah. And that sends a message, saying, oh yeah, I had to meet with my supervisor, review the policies and procedures and sign off on them again. They're really okay. HIPAA is just about paperwork. Mm-hmm. If the company really did think, I've heard this, if the company really did think what he did was wrong, they would have fired him. They talked to him for 30 minutes. He still got his job. Nobody said anything out about it. So clearly it's no big deal. the company understands sometimes these things happen and they support me because I didn't fire somebody that clearly did something wrong.
Yeah.
So what would you do, David, if you made a mistake and violated policy?
If I personally did it?
Yeah, because I mean, we're talking about how should the business owners deal with it? What would a business owner's reaction be if you violated policy?
I mean, I would hold myself to the same standard I hold my employees to, and I would go through the same process.
But you can't fire yourself.
I can't fire myself, but
what can you do to show that you respect the law and that you believe in the policies and procedures that protect information and protect the company as a whole? You know, I say I screwed up and I apologize to each and every one of you.
Yeah, you take ownership of it. Yeah. Absolutely. And, you know, you do have to find, and sometimes you have to get a little bit creative, but you do have to find ways that do something. You may have to do something to yourself that hurts. You know, if I'm going to take somebody that's working the front desk and give them 3 days off without pay, then maybe I should take 3 days of my pay and donate it to a charity. So that, so that there is that same punishment level, which is not having money for those 3 days. But you have to do something so your people see that you're taking it seriously. You're not just saying, "Oh, I goofed up. I can't lose my job. Ha ha."
Right.
You still has to be something there that happens.
Yeah. And so that gets into, as a business owner and a leader, you know, you should be thinking about that. Even if you're just in management, you know, what are you going to do if you make a mistake? Are you going to try to blow it off? Or are you going to try to say, you know what? I screw up. We all screw up, but this is what I'm doing to correct it. Mm-hmm. Because the law says that the sanctions and policies apply to the workforce.
Yeah. Well, I know for me and our organization, I do more training than anybody. So they can't look at me and say, well, you're not doing the training you expect us to do.
Right.
I mean, I do 10 times more training than anybody else.
Well, you and I, we get a little, you know, every freaking week we're showing that we're learning something and we're staying on top of it and we're worried about the, you know.
Right. But even if I was not in the position I'm in, I think that the upper management C-suite people, they should be doing more training than everybody else, not less, because we're in a position where things can happen in a much more severe fashion than to somebody else. Like, for example, business email compromise. You know, if they get into my inbox, it's going to be a whole lot worse for the company than it is if they get into one of my employees' inbox.
Yeah, you fall under, you got the spear phishing and then you got the whale phishing where they think, okay, you are the key individual, so we're going to go after you. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't matter whether it's somebody who volunteers or they're an intern or they're a trainee. It just does not matter. Everybody should understand what their obligations are.
Yep.
I mean, we've got a case that, we know where they brought in a temp person to clean out a closet who threw away a bunch of patient records in a dumpster.
Yeah.
Even though it said, don't touch this shelf.
Yeah. And you have to wonder, do you sanction that person only? Do you sanction that person and the person who told them to clean out the closet? Because maybe they weren't very clear as to what to do and not to do in that closet.
Yeah, I'm not saying that you need to take that person and put them through a week's worth of training to clean out a closet. But somebody that's in charge should go in and evaluate everything. It's a mini SRA. What do we have at risk here? Oh, well, we don't store any old tech stuff. We don't store any old patient records in here. There's no medical information in here whatsoever. Good to go. If there's medical information in here, I got to make sure they know what to do and what not to do.
Yeah. I think I would have just moved it out of the closet. Before you have somebody, just move it out, then let him clean it out, and then put it back.
Well, in this case, it was, a bunch of folks got together and decided that was going to get cleaned out, and it was assigned to somebody. So then that somebody just brought in a kid to do it rather than taking care of it themselves and didn't really mention it to anybody. Mm. You know how that goes.
Yeah.
Small business. Mm-hmm. I don't have time to do it. I got some help. Just treat it the right way. I when I let the kids, now I shut down all my stuff and I got 42 layers of security on all my things and my networks are all You know, my nieces and nephews come over and they go, "What can we connect to today? Have you changed anything?"
Yeah.
But even then, they get lectured that they don't go into the space that's my office.
Right.
Period. You just don't go in there because I don't have anything there, but I don't even want you in there. So they don't cross the little line, really, you know, unless somebody throws a game controller or something.
Yeah. But when it comes to PHI, we've said this in the past, and other people have too. But if you do treat it as if it were a precious metal, gold, platinum, whatever, if you honestly treat it that way, you know, you wouldn't have a kid coming in and there's a box full of gold sitting on the shelf. You wouldn't have you would move that because you would like, I don't want this stuff to get missing.
Well, and I would know that I've got a box of gold in there.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that is important. And I would pay attention to that. In a lot of cases, this lack of having a full inventory and awareness of where everything is, it becomes a thing. So when you have it scattered all about, it catches up with you. But again, paper. Can't forget about paper. And the big thing that we do want to get across is sanctions apply to everybody. Employees, volunteers, trainees, and other persons whose conduct in the performance of work for a covered entity or business associate is under the direct control of such covered entity or business associate, whether or not they are paid by the covered entity or business associate. That's the workforce. It's described in the law. Well, I'm sorry, defined is different than described, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And for any of you that question that, OCR did a settlement just last year. We covered it with Allergy Associates of Hartford. It's the one of what I should have said was nothing. Because the doctor, you know, the privacy officer said, don't talk to that reporter. The doctor did it anyway. But the reason they got in trouble was they did nothing.
Yep.
They were in the news and they did nothing. Nothing. That's the part that's trouble.
Yeah.
So as a business owner, you know, smaller businesses are what we feel like micro businesses versus the bigger ones where you have an HR department. Obviously, in the smaller businesses, there's not a lot of layers of decision making.
No.
There's me or you. It's the kind of thing is how everybody looks at it. But in a larger organization where they have several employees, more than us, maybe 20, 30 times more than us. We'll go even further, but they have a privacy or security officer who's responsible for these investigations. They provide the findings with a recommendation based on the sanction policy. That's what their job is. And a lot of time people get that confused. If they're the privacy or security officer, that's all you're supposed to do. You're not supposed to be making those final decisions unless that's your rule. You make a recommendation. Here's what we found. These are the violations. This is what our sanction policy says. This is my recommendation. Mm-hmm. And then you give it over to HR or who's responsible for that. And then all the decisions should follow your normal HR management policies for an infraction. But you know what I'm saying. You don't want to be the failing to sanction person because you're in, deep stuff.
No,
up an unsanitary tributary without adequate means of propulsion.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah, it's kind of the whole, do you want me to tear you up or do you want your dad wait till your dad gets home? No, go ahead and do it now, Mom.
Get it over with. Wait till I tell your father. I'd rather you tell him, actually, is what I always say. Go ahead and tell him. He's not as mad as you are right now. That was an SRA done quickly. So, but we're going to talk about what should be in your policy because that's what everybody wants to know is, okay, you've told me all these things, so what should be in my policy? Mm-hmm. But before we do that, also, Help Me with HIPAA is brought to you in part by Security First IT.
What?
I know. 2/3 of small businesses that experience a cybersecurity breach end up closing their doors within 6 months. Cyber criminals are targeting your practice and coming after your most sensitive data. Visit us online. Schedule a time to talk about what you can do to protect yourself, your patients, and your practice. The website is securityfirstit.com. That's securityfirstit.com.
FIRST.
Yes. Yeah. I'm not allowed to talk about my issues with that.
Yeah, I know.
Okay. So there's our second ad. We're getting this down a little bit at a time. Okay, David, what should be in your sanction policy?
First of all, I would document the requirements and the methods that I use. And so we talked about that a little bit already.
Well, you got to document how you're going to document it.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah. What are you going to document? How are you going to document it? Where are you going to keep the documentation? Who has access to it?
Well, because there's HIPAA compliance documentation and then there's HR documentation. And we've got a lot of cases where people will say, well, if it involved anything to do with sanctions, it just stays in HR.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but again, when it comes to HIPAA compliance, if you're responsible for knowing how the sanction policy was applied and being able to provide that information, I would suggest you get a summary from HR and put it in your compliance documentation, which is another reason to limit access to some of your compliance documentation.
Oh, yeah. Which also makes it a lot easier if somebody comes knocking at your door and says, I need some information from you.
Well, yeah, because you don't know if HR has a system to find that information quickly. And what if, different people use different filing methods and blah, 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 blah. Get it in with your compliance documentation. Be done with it. Because you're going to be asked to say what happened. Now, you can say, we recommended X, but what you got to know is what actually happened.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say put it in both places, but limit access to it.
Right.
And at what point do you consider the case closed? Who signs off and says, all decisions are made, no more sanctions apply here, we're done? That's a tricky one.
Mm-hmm.
Because everybody wants to throw the hot potato somewhere else.
Yeah. Well, that gets into the investigation process itself. Who's going to be involved in that? Is it going to be the same person? Because, you mentioned the micro companies. You're going to have the same person potentially, it could be doing all this.
Yeah, every step is the same person because that's all we got.
Yeah.
But in the bigger companies, I've seen the cases where, okay, this gets reported to the privacy officer because remember, that's in the notice of privacy practices and those kind of things. So a complaint comes in or somebody realizes and confesses, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that way you've got the privacy officers where things start usually. And then they go to the security officer and say, well, who has access to this? And what do the logs say? And those kind of things. And the security officer just supplies those things usually, unless it's one of their staff that's involved. But then you got to interview people. If you don't ask questions, you don't know. And I've seen cases where they took a single letter, read the letter, and closed the investigation without asking anybody any questions. And later you're like, you mean you seriously didn't even ask them if they actually did it? You never even asked them? Well, no, it kind of seemed like we didn't really have to do that because it said that we should investigate. And, we already kind of thought about it.
Do you see companies, I know probably the bigger ones probably do, but do you see any of the smaller companies having a third party come in and do this, especially since, they may not be able to be objective if it's a smaller company?
Well, there are some, that get, bigger small companies than what you and I are. You start to get 100, 200 employees. Often you're going to have like an HR company that advises you and they come in, or legal counsel, those kind of things that are coming in and deciding how you're going to do things and advising you on how to handle it in the cases that are severe. If it's, okay, look, you didn't turn over your desk, so I'm going to retrain you. Or clean desk policy, you're not following clean desk policy, I'm going to retrain you. But next time, if you don't start following this, it's going to go up the chain. It's not going to stay with just, we're going to retrain you.
Mm-hmm.
And, there's always the thing about, I'm not going to write you up. It's a verbal warning, and then writing you up is what actually goes into your HR file. Well, you have to have those records that you've already given them a verbal warning somewhere.
Yeah. You have to have a written document of the verbal warning.
That's right. Otherwise, how do you know that you've not already done that? And another thing is, there's cases where they, in the investigation, they go to each person and have them write in a story of what they know about the situation, write it down and sign it. Just like you always see on the cop shows, write down that confession right there. Tell me everything you did. And people then have it in writing and they've signed it. Do you want to record those on audio? Do you want to record them on video and have the paperwork? Got to remember, this stuff ends up in legal proceedings. So in some ways, you definitely want the information. And in other ways, maybe you don't. Which is why a lot of times you get, if it's complicated and serious, you're going to get your attorney to be involved in the investigation.
Mm-hmm.
And that gets back to, how long should the investigation take? I mean, you need to have this in your plan about, well, we can't let this drag on for months. You've got to decide what you're going to do. And if the person being investigated may need to be suspended or have their access removed during the investigation. You certainly don't want to be investigating somebody that actually did something, wrong, and they still are in their job with access. They could be really wreaking havoc or trying to cover it up or destroy things or intimidate people. You don't know what's happening.
Yeah, absolutely. So
you got to have a plan. And you also have to have a plan that says, if I get to this point, just like the HIPAA enforcement rule says, once we determine that willful neglect is involved, we don't have to keep investigating. We can just stop. So do you want to do that? Once you realize that it's really bad and they're the only ones involved, and you don't need to keep spending the time investigating. Now I'm just going to go to, all right, here's how we're going to handle it. So again, that gets into your policy should define how your investigation is going to work.
Right.
But then you get to the tricky part. Everybody's fine. They can do this part. But then you get to, how do you decide what to do?
Yeah.
And again, I recommend that you don't have a policy, which is what most people do, is a policy that says, we're going to take everything into consideration and apply appropriate sanctions.
Okay. Why don't you recommend that?
Well, how are you going to be sure you're actually applying those sanctions equally across the board? How are you going to be able to take emotion out of it and just follow the logic and the rules?
Mm-hmm.
How are you going to make sure that two different people make the same decisions?
I think you create, what we were talking about earlier, where you already have lines of this. If this happens, then, we're going to look at, has it happened before? And, was it willful neglect? And so, basically you create a matrix that addresses the things.
That's a great idea, David.
I thought so too.
But you want it to be both subjective and objective. I need to have where it's hard numbers, facts, and then I can make some decisions. You don't want to do all of either one.
Mm-hmm.
Because, okay, there's the culpability level. We already talked about why that's important to have it in there. Is it reasonable to believe that they really didn't understand what they were doing was wrong, that we screwed up in training them? Is it clear they tried to figure out the right thing but made the wrong decision? Or they violated the policy, but they thought it was okay to violate it this one time because somebody told them that or whatnot. Or, my favorites, they knew what they were doing was wrong. They did it anyway. They didn't care.
Yeah,
and I've actually heard people say that. I knew it was wrong. I was going to do it anyway because it mattered to me. I made an executive decision about how we were going to run this company and secure our data, meaning it doesn't apply to me.
Yeah, that never works out well.
No, it's just like if your kids, if you say you knew that was wrong, well, yeah, but I did it anyway. Does that mean they get a lesser punishment or an equal punishment to, I'm sorry, I forgot, I thought this, I thought that. They tried to make a decision, they did it wrong. Which one's going to get worse?
Yeah, they're going to get it a lot worse.
I remember when they were younger and you used the apps to alert you when they went outside a certain circle.
I still use that. I use it on Lori now.
It was like, okay, if you leave this area, you can't drive, you'll lose, the car. Mm-hmm. And then somebody got busted by going out of the area and they're like, how do you know?
Yeah.
I always look at them. Do you know what I do for a living?
Yeah.
Let's review. When it comes to how do you know things, let's just don't get into that, okay? Mm-hmm. We got people, we know things, but the responsibility level absolutely matters. And that comes from not only what did they do, but what kind of, if you're in leadership levels, leaders lead by example. Everybody, it's not do as I say, not as I do. That's not effective. But if you have a leader setting examples, their failures and sanctions set examples also, or lack thereof. You can bet if you've got leaders who aren't being sanctioned or, if everybody knows this happened, yet it's never mentioned what happened to the leaders involved, the staff is like, screw it. It doesn't matter. I'm not following the rules.
Yeah.
And it also applies if it's somebody with a high level of access or controls like IT people.
Oh, yeah.
Their mistakes are way worse, so they should be held to a higher standard of making sure they're following checklists and all these other things. They have way more policies to follow. Like your policy about transporting computers. Share that one.
Yeah, so in our company, we typically don't have PHI ever. But the few times we could have it actually in our possession is when we transport computers from the practice back to our office if we're doing some work on them. So our policy about transferring those or transporting them is that the technician puts them in the vehicle, gets in the vehicle immediately, so we don't have them going out there, put them in the car, and then going back in doing more work for an hour. Put them in the car, get in the car immediately, come straight to the office. You do not stop for anything other than the stoplights. You don't stop to get gas. You don't stop to use the restroom. If something comes up and you have to stop, then you have to call and we have to get another employee on site to stand by that machine. We just don't. You cannot let that out of your sight. And it's some people may think it's overkill. The employees look at you kind of crazy when you say that, but it's that important that we do not want that data to ever leave the possession of that person.
And what happens if they don't follow that?
In most cases, they'll probably just be fired the first time.
Exactly. So you're evaluating the severity, and the policy clearly states all the ways you can get around any problems that you have, and you make sure they know it, and you say, if you don't do this, you can be fired right away.
Yeah.
If they're in a car accident or something and unconscious, that's different.
Yeah. Then I might just give them a few days off.
They
should have called us before they had a car accident.
Jeez. But you see that with David's policy, it makes it very clear. You're responsible for this. This is how it must be done, and we will fire you. It's that important. That is what makes people pay attention. It's important if there's an important response to it. All of our laws have sanction policies built in. There's obviously, culpability differences in everything from receipt of stolen property versus I stole it versus I even knew that it was stolen. They're all different things. So they look at the scenario, they look at the people involved, they look at how much trouble they've been in. You're going to do the exact same thing because it's following the law. That's what we're talking about, is following the law. So you're going to look at their responsibility level. How many times has this happened? The number of cases or violations. Come on, don't keep telling me the same story. You come in here with the same story again, I'm not going to believe you.
Mm-hmm.
Or a whole bunch of minor violations, they're going to add up.
Yep.
You know, obviously something's going wrong if you have constant minor violations. Either they don't care or they haven't been trained, even though, you know, they've been to the training classes, but they weren't paying attention. Or maybe there is a actual inability to do the job. They're just not capable of that. And that happens for some people.
Mm-hmm.
But it must be dealt with, and having that matrix that looks at, all right, was the level of responsibility here, here, or here, and that adds a certain severity to it. Did the violation require us to report it? That's going to add some severity to it. That's going to be much more, you know, you actually had an improper disposal, or disposal. Could have been that.
Mm-hmm.
You actually had to report a data breach versus there was a violation of policy, but nothing bad happened. And how much do they participate? Was there a conspiracy involved? Were there a bunch of people involved? Was it, you know, again, a management person with intent? The level of intent? How sneaky are they? You know, did they use somebody else's credentials? Did they try to cover it up, get others to lie? How much did they cooperate with the investigation?
You know, if somebody's being sneaky, then you can't say, I didn't really know.
No, right? I didn't know it was wrong, but you hid it all these 15 ways and you lied all these times. You know, but so that is really important, is to lay out in your policy that there's some black and white decisions, like the number of times, the number of people, do you have to report it or not? So that, like David, he could have a rep that he thinks is great, but then they just outright violate the policy by taking it home overnight. What are you going to have to do? They take that computer home instead of taking it to the office, and they're the best rep, and they say, what are you going to do? Fire me?
Yes.
I will fire you. And it's unfortunate that there are cases that are people that way, but you got to make it clear. You will be fired. I don't care who you are. And then, of course, how are you going to handle the decisions? Who gets to make the decisions for all employees? What if it's management? What if it's clinical, administrative, technical staff? Who makes those final decisions after you've evaluated and done the investigation and gathered all the information for the matrix sanction policy? Somebody still has to make that, you know, decision.
Mm-hmm.
And how are you going to address those sanctions that apply to management or people that are, you know, what if the scary, but what if the privacy officer is the one that screwed up? Who does the investigation? Who's going to handle it? But, you know, it's not ridiculous to have a plan that says who's going to discuss these sanctions with those involved. And, you know, there's that just had the shooting, you know, not too long ago. Where was it? In Ohio? Where the guy got called in and his supervisor and the HR person and the VP was in there, and they call him in and tell him he's going to be fired, and he pulls out a gun and shoots everybody in the room. You know, there's a lot of things you have to worry about today
Oh, yeah.
that you shouldn't have to, but it's just the nature of, you know, if everybody's going to have a gun, everybody's got a gun. And what if the sanction includes termination? You better have somebody disconnecting them if you haven't already before.
Oh, Lord, don't get me on that kick.
So there you have it. These are the kind of things, and I can assure you, if there are no consequences, then no one's going to follow the policies and procedures. And if nobody's following the policies and procedures, well, you know, you don't really have a privacy and security program at all.
Right. Yep. And we often see that where, yes, we have all the documentation, we have all the policies and procedures, we have rules and all that. And then It's like, you mean to tell me you've never sanctioned anybody? There's never been a case where you've had to sanction somebody?
Mm-hmm.
I find that hard to believe.
Yeah, and I've seen that on OCR investigations. Show me, all of the sanctions you did in the first 6 months of 2018.
Mm-hmm.
Or all of 2018. Depending on the size of the entity, you could ask different things. So.
Yeah. Yeah, but it is the hardest part in some ways because, you're dealing with having to punish people or sometimes fire people. And it's, I don't like doing it. And not only do I not like doing it, but there's a bigger cost involved because now I got to find somebody else and hire them and train them. And it's a painful process.
Well, and business leaders a lot of them really just hate to fire people. Some because, they want to be seen as mean. Others worry about the legal implications and lawsuits of firing somebody. Others claim the ex-employee is going to retaliate. Well, if they're going to retaliate because you fire them, they're still going to do stuff inside even worse.
Yeah. Yeah, there's all kind of retaliation. We even know of times where somebody gets fired from a job and, they retaliate by filing complaints with OCR on that practice because they're not doing things properly, or heck, even if they are, it still may spark an investigation.
Well, and as we learned from Allison, a whistleblower complaint that, it's an employee who's angry, but the privacy and security program, if it sucks, it sucks. The investigation is still going to find that.
Mm-hmm.
If you're doing the right thing, then it won't be painful at all. But if you're not, then you should worry about retaliation.
Yeah. Or even if they don't get fired. There's some people who quit jobs and they're disgruntled, and they can still come back and cause
or they
problems.
Stay in jobs and they're disgruntled. There's a long
there is that.
But whistleblowers are whistleblowers, and the bottom line is, if you're going to say, well, it's a disgruntled employee, so it shouldn't count, you can't do that. You can say, it's a disgruntled employee. We apologize. Here's all of our information you've asked for. We've done everything we know how to do to handle them.
Right.
Totally different results.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, then.
All right, that is our show for today, folks. Remember to follow us and share us out on your favorite social media site. Rate us on our podcasting app. Yes, we do have an app for that. We need your help to keep spreading the word. And as always, remember for Donna and myself that HIPAA is not about compliance. It's about patient care.
You've been listening to the Help Me with HIPAA podcast, hosted by Donna Grindle and David Sims. The show created to help you with HIPAA. For more information or to ask us a question, visit our website at helpmewithhipaa.com. Neither Donna Grindle or David Sims are attorneys, and they do not offer binding legal advice concerning regulatory compliance. The information in this podcast should not be relied upon or construed as legal advice in any way. Consult your attorney for legal advice concerning compliance with HIPAA regulations.